You're listening to KKRZ 103.9 FM, The Pork. Like The Pork on Facebook. And follow The Pork on Twitter at The Pork FM.
That's some tasty pork.
Yeah, it is.
One is a former executive at Alliance Atlantis. The other, a lawyer with Zifrin, Brittenham, Branca, Fisher, Gilbert Lurie, Stiffelman, Cook, Johnson, Landy, and Wolf, LLP. This is Biz Talk with Kurt Tobias and Zane Moltek on 103.9 The Pork.
Hello, ham hogs, and welcome to Biz Talk. I am Kurt Tobias.
And I'm Zane Moltek.
And we are here to bring you all your business news in the Portland area. First things first, you should like us on Facebook, 1039 The Pork, and also follow us on Twitter at The Pork FM.
We'll also be accepting some calls later on in the show. The phone number's 503-555-1039, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. And feel free to text in throughout the show, star 1039. You can do that on your Verizon handset. We'd love to get you in on the conversation here today, and that conversation's going to be Transmedia.
It certainly will, and we're mentioning all these different ways to participate in the show, sort of ironic, good way to start it off. And if you haven't had quite enough of the content from our talk on the airwaves, we also have a blog, biztalkthepork.blogspot.com, biztalkthepork.blogspot.com. More Transmedia. We are a multifaceted show, and that is the topic of conversation today. And you know what? We are a radio show ourselves, so let's start things off discussing marketing and the way that other radio shows are doing it. And
start off close to home, what we know.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk radio is what we know as well. So let's take a look at Coast to Coast AM. It's the most listened to overnight radio show in North America, and that's for a reason, isn't it, Zane?
It's syndicated across about 560 or so radio stations, one of which is the Pork FM. We actually play it regularly. I don't know if it's every night of the week, but I know it's on all the time. And it's one of the more interactive kind of national radio shows that's out there.
That's right, and they use frequent call-ins in that show as well in terms of increasing the audience participation. You've got George Noreen, he's a great host there as well, but it's not only that, it's not only the content, but they have a website as well that really adds to the entire experience.
Yeah, absolutely, and the website, the best way that I could describe the website for Coast to Coast AM to someone who knows nothing about the program and doesn't really even follow talk radio would be to say it's as though you took CNN or like BBC News' website and then you link that to a radio show. Except the difference is that not all the content, like the website and the radio show aren't kind of the content's exclusive to each of them. It's the website goes off on a ton of different stuff that they don't even get close to in the radio show. It just completely expands and makes that whole experience that much bigger and that much more in-depth.
Well, I think you said the word right there. It's an experience, and I think that is what sets Coast to Coast ahead of perhaps its competitors. It's an experience. It's not just a radio show. Coast to Coast is in itself an entire media entity, and you mentioned the call-ins, the website, but they're also extremely active on their Twitter account.
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned the call-ins. Everyone knows who listens to Coast to Coast. You got the west of the Rockies line. You got the east of the Rockies line. But yeah, Twitter, and it's not maybe something you would necessarily expect. We'll get into it later, but I mean, based on the demographics of the show, you see how active they are in Twitter or not, and you wouldn't necessarily think of Coast to Coast AM as being exclusive to a younger audience that participates in social media a lot, but nonetheless, it's something they utilize quite a bit.
Well, their use of Transmedia undoubtedly has absolutely broadened the demographic that show does appeal to and 100% increase their audience. They're unparalleled right now, and Transmedia is a huge reason why.
I would say especially, though, unparalleled in terms of a national syndicated talk show, and especially a show that is so late at night when it's more difficult to get that audience participation, but it's not lacking whatsoever for Coast to Coast AM.
No, certainly not. They are always flooded with calls, and we are actually getting flooded with tweets right now, Zane, and the one in particular I like here, it's from Patricia, and she's tweeting us about Roz and Mocha, and they're a show in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. And I know we've both spent some time in Toronto before, and I do know Mocha a little bit. And they're talking about their show as well. They're doing a morning show, I believe, in Toronto right now. And they are extremely active in terms of transmedia as well. Twitter, they use like crazy there as well, at Roz Weston, at Mocha925. But they also do a blog.
Yeah, and this is something, as I mentioned, Coast to Coast AM kind of goes above and beyond in terms of the blogging, where they have the whole website, so it makes the blog obsolete. But we have a blog ourselves. Other shows we're going to talk about, a lot of them have blogs, and it's especially these morning shows where it's so focused, so based on the host, and this is a way for the audience to interact and kind of learn more and get inside the host's mind, not just within the show, not just listening to what they have to say on the air, but, you know, getting a little bit of that personal feeling outside of the show as well, and learning kind of their day-to-day thoughts on whatever subjects they may have covered on the show or those outside of the show.
Yes, well, Roz Mocha, they're relatively new on the scene. It's sort of a top 40 station morning show, but they've already made a big impact. And another big reason is using other media not just to enhance the show experience, but to draw in new audience. And they've done so by just plastering the Toronto subways with ads, is what I'm told. Just everywhere, all these subway ads, which apparently has worked extremely well. Also Facebook, which is it's a pretty common thing, but that is something that I don't think every show takes full advantage of. But if you ever go on Roz and Mocha's Facebook page, it's full of content.
No, and the ads are something, I mean, that's something, you take the blue line on the Max like I do every morning in town, and you don't see ads for radio shows. You see ads for TV, you see ads for products, all stuff like that. But radio show ads in terms of kind of captive advertising on subways, bus, things like that, it's not that often of an occurrence. But nonetheless, Roz and Mocha try and take advantage of that.
And you know what? A final piece of transmedia that Roz and Mocha use as well, and this is again thanks to our tweeter Patricia. She linked me to this. They have a YouTube channel. And that's a little rare. You do see that. You sometimes see a Vimeo, sort of a YouTube channel. But Roz and Mocha, they put all the prime interviews, all these prime segments, and if they're mentioning something in the show, they're talking about an event in the news, they're talking about an event that has happened to them, they'll keep their audience abreast, allow them to catch up by posting that on their YouTube channel as well.
But one thing, though, and we'll contrast this with the Dean Blundell show, which I know that both of us listen to quite a bit when we were in Toronto, that morning commute into the city. The YouTube channel is just kind of exclusively content that they've had from the show, which now if we can kind of change gears to with the Dean Blundell show, they'll not only post interviews, and one thing with the Dean Blundell show is that they'll do a lot of live performances with bands that are in Toronto, obviously a alternative new rock music kind of station, so the audience just loves that. But they'll also get YouTube footage of kind of features that they'll go out and do in the field, things that have nothing to do with the show. And that's actually something that we also see with the blog on the Dean Blundell show. And it's the way that they differentiate themselves from some other shows in that market, is that their blog is, for those of you out there that are familiar with websites like Reddit or 9gag, where it's kind of a listing or a bunch of items that are funny pictures or funny videos, just kind of social media and things that can go viral, and that's kind of what they've done with their blog, in addition to having that personal perspective from the hosts.
Well, and also the Dean Blundell show, they do go above and beyond. I think it's pretty safe to say at this point, in terms of younger audiences, they're unparalleled. They have a tremendous share. They're on 102.1 The Edge in Toronto. You can't argue with the numbers. 18.2 rating in terms of young males, so just phenomenal numbers. But they do segments as well that are specifically to reach out to the audience. Todd on the Street, for example. I know you're a big fan of the Todd on the Street segment.
I was featured on a couple Todd on the Streets, actually.
Yeah, well, not surprising. They've done a great job. It's a funny show, right? It's edgy, and they use everything at their disposal to make it more so.
Well, the amazing thing is with the Dean Blundell show is obviously we mentioned it's that young, mainly male demographic that they go for, and obviously one of the best ways to reach that demographic in today's day and age is by utilizing social media, by utilizing all these things we talked about. And one thing that I know from my year and a half of listening to the show is that Dean, who is the Dean Blundell from the show, would always mention that it's not just us creating the content. A large part of the show is the fans tweeting in, the fans calling in with stories, the fans participating in interviews, things like that really made the show. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic where through the use of Transmedia, the Dean Blundell Show has kind of allowed the fans to create the content for their show.
So really, they are a part of the show experience. They're not so much just viewers, they're not so much just listeners, but they're part of the show itself, which is pretty amazing.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's something that we're going to see more and more with other shows, especially that focus on this younger demographic moving forward.
Well, this is what we've gone over now. We've gone over Coast to Coast AM. They are absolutely at the top of their genre in terms of talk radio, in terms of conspiracy, a little bit of supernatural as well. We've talked about Roz and Mocha. They are the top undisputed top 40 station in the Toronto area, and Dean Blundell, absolutely top morning show, I believe, in general in the Toronto area. One demographic we haven't discussed yet, and that's sports.
Yeah, and apparently we're getting a couple of listeners. We're live tweeting the show right now, and we got Jim Lang from Toronto actually tweeting us about Primetime Sports. Actually, a very well-known sports program. Probably, I'd say the most affluent sports program in all of Canada.
Well, it's hosted by Bob McCowan, and we've met Bob a couple of times. And Bob, actually, he was the North American Radio Air Talent of the Year in 2007, so that certainly doesn't help. But Jim's made a good point here. Primetime Sports has been tremendously successful, and they don't really use Transmedia as much.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just quickly surfing around the net here, trying to find some stuff. It looks like they don't have any Twitter page really for the show. Bob himself does have a feed, but from what I can see here, just looking through the last couple of weeks, it's nothing really that related to the show itself.
Bobcat's not a big tweeter, no, that's for sure. That probably does have something to do, Zane, with the audience that they're going for. They're going for more the middle-aged, older crowd than, say, a Dean Blundell or a Roz and Mocha might be. But you know what? They go with the old-school mediums in terms of advertising. We talked about how huge advertising is, but they're more the traditional billboard, newspaper ad, some TV ads as well once in a while. But you know what? They're not really using the new mediums, and they do have call-ins sometimes, but it's not so much, reaching out to the listeners. They're just showing their product, showing their content, how good they are, and that's attracting listeners on that alone.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, obviously, Dean Blundell Show, the Roz and Mocha Show, both relatively new programs. You think about it in the big perspective, Dean Blundell on the air now for just over 10 years, I believe, Roz and Mocha less than that. But Primetime Sports is a program that's been around since the 80s, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I believe so.
So it's very much so they're basing things on their reputation. And we mentioned how the Dean Blundell Show kind of uses Transmedia to allow the audience to play a role in creating the content. But that's not necessarily Primetime Sports. Obviously well known for having huge guests on the show. But one thing that they do in terms of Transmedia that we don't really see with the other programs we've discussed is they simulcast on television on Rogers Sportsnet. Now, Rogers actually does this with one other program that they have on their radio show, the Hockey Central, at noon. It also goes to the TV broadcast. Well, that's interesting. That's not something that we see a whole lot of.
No, you're right, absolutely. And that's been very successful, actually, on the air. You think, you know what, who's going to want to watch these old guys sitting around talking about sports? But it has been extremely successful for the Rogers family. But in general, just looking at the radio side again for a second here, they have gone with the traditional medium, the traditional way of advertising, the traditional way of operating a radio show, more or less. Not completely, but more or less sort of the traditional way, and not really a huge change from how they would have done it 10, 15 years ago. And they're still the top-rated show. They've got a 10.2 rating. You can't argue with that. They're the highest-rated sports talk show in Toronto. So it really shows that at this point, as much as we've talked about Transmedia helping these shows, you can still be successful without it.
Yeah, I just wish that we could get a 10.2 rating here.
No kidding. There is another show on this station, on Sportsnet 590 The Fan, that we should point out too, and this is Tim and Sid. And really, they're a big contrast to McCowan. They're right before him in the 1 to 4 time slot. They're the second highest rated sports show in Toronto. It looks like the Fan 590 has really got a monopoly there. But they're very different. They appeal to the younger crowd, and they really make much better use of Transmedia.
Yeah, it's amazing. You look at Tim and Sid, I mean, if you take a second and look at their Twitter feed, it's just an explosion of tweets every day between 1 and 4. And it's another thing that's similar to Dean Blundell's show, where they kind of allow those that are tweeting in And I don't know how much they use call-in segments. I believe they use it a decent amount.
Well, not so much really with audience, and they really move away from the audience sort of call-ins, but they take so many tweets, and they have the match game, I believe is what they call it, which is when they'll throw out sort of a potential question with a blank at the end, and then you have the audience participate that way, occasionally calling in, usually tweeting, texting in, filling in the answers.
And exactly what I'm getting to. It's another situation where the audiences can participate and kind of guide the show in terms of what the content's going to be.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you look at all these examples, and we know the local shows here in Portland. We know the other shows that are in Toronto, and none of this is really varying from the norm. I mean, just about every single radio show now, they have their Twitter feeds, they have their links to Facebook pages, they'll be doing call-in segments. We see Primetime Sports deviates a little bit, but nonetheless, it's kind of an even playing field in terms of transmedia across the board for radio shows.
It appears that way in terms of the successful ones anyway. So by and large, it appears most of the successful shows are using transmedia, but it's not, it's an inexact science here. You can't 100% determine how much that has affected their ratings, because you see McCowan and Primetime Sports not using it so much, still getting the good ratings. But you know what? At the very least, you can say transmedia has been effective to a degree, and it certainly hasn't hurt.
Yeah, absolutely, Kurt. And we'd love to get your guys' thoughts on some transmedia out there. Maybe some recent examples that some of you listeners can think of in terms of transmedia in the Portland area. So we'll be taking your calls after the break. The number is 503-555-1039.
Yes, that's right. After the break, as you mentioned, because we are right up against it right now, it is time for a Pork FM traffic and weather update.
High above Portland is our own Alan Broomfield in the Pork Chopper. Alan?
Thank you, Zane. We've got some heavy volume on the Southwest Sunset Highway headed into Portland today. The Ross Island Bridge is shut down for construction. You may want to try taking the Hawthorne Bridge as an alternative. Johnson Street is closed between 14th Avenue and 10th. At Jameson Square there for the UD O'Brien Parade, of course, the first mayor of our wonderful city. And the Blue Line on the Max is shut down between Beaverton Central Station and Willow Creek Station, both north and southbound. That's for track construction. This traffic report is brought to you by Hellfires of Satan 4, a return to the fires of hell again, in theaters April 26th.
And of course, we remind you to tweet at the Pork Traffic or text 55655 with any issues you see on the roads.
But make sure not to text while you're driving. And now, with the weather report from the Pork FM Weather Center, is DeAndre Smith. DeAndre?
Thank you, Kurt. Taking a look at the current weather, it is 55 degrees. Just a couple of clouds in the sky. Tonight, overnight, we're going to see some showers as the temperature drops down to 45. Looking ahead to the rest of the week, we'll have rain through to Saturday, temperatures ranging between 57 and 61. And then Sunday, we'll get some nice weather coming in. It'll be sunny with a high of 63, and that peaking on Tuesday at 73 degrees Fahrenheit. This weather report is brought to you by the Portland Trailblazers. Catch the final Trailblazers game of the season tonight at 7:30 on the official broadcaster of the Trailblazers, 103.9 FM, The Pork.
All right, thank you, DeAndre. After the break, we'll take a couple listener calls. The topic of the day today is transmedia here on BizTalk with Kurt and Zane on 103.9 The Pork. Paramount Pictures wants to send you to a free early screening of Hellfires of Satan 4, A Return to the Fires of Hell, again.
Reveal that you've return to the Hellfires of Satan.
Yeah, that's right, Satan. And I'm gonna battle you in the fires of hell, again. Keep an eye out around the city of Portland for thermometers that will tell you the temperature of hell.
Oh my God, McNeil, the fire is hot!
And then text your temperature of hell to 44598 to receive a link for your portal to hell.
I hope you brought power, McNeil.
Hellfires of Satan 4, A Return to the Fires of Hell Again, hits theaters Friday, April 26th.
You will never extinguish the fires of hell,
Join Portland sports experts Tyler Zoltek, Alex Bloomfield, and Toby Kerr weekdays from 4 to 5 on Stats Never Lie.
The Trailblazers are who we thought they were. What do you mean by that?
Also, follow at Stats Never Lie on Twitter to keep up to date with the Trailblazers, Timbers, and Winterhawks, plus all the latest from the world of sports.
We got breaking news here. The Timbers have just traded for midfielder Jackie Moon.
Stats Never Lie, the biggest guests, the earliest scoops, and most in-depth stories. Only on 103.9 The Pork.
The Walking Dead video game pits you against the Walking Dead. It's available now, only at Best Buy. Also, check out The Walking Dead Sundays at 9 o'clock on AMC. And visit amctv.com/The Walking Dead for all the latest on The Walking Dead.
You're listening to KKRZ, Portland, Oregon. 103.9 FM, The Pork. The Rose City's favorite talk radio station. Follow The Pork on Twitter at The Pork FM. And become a ham hock by visiting 1039theporkfm.com.
Now back to Biz Talk with Kurt and Zane on 103.9 The Pork.
Welcome back, Ham Hocks, to Biz Talk. Zane Moltek alongside Kurt Tobias. We are taking your calls. The topic today is Transmedia. I believe we have a caller on the line. Before we get to there, just remind you, you can tweet into the show at the Pork FM. We're taking the calls, and feel free to text as well, star 1039 on your Verizon handset.
Well, it's almost a little ironic that we're actually taking these calls, considering how we just talked about, tweets, the use of transmedia sort of replacing the traditional call-ins. But, we can be a little bit traditional here on The Pork. So,
Oh, absolutely.
So we are going to take a call right now, and on the line with us is Victor from Hayhurst. Victor, go ahead.
Hey there, guys. I'm a first-time caller, long-time listener. I'm a big WoW fan. That's World of Warcraft, for those who don't know. I started a couple years ago because of those YouTube ads with celebrities, like Chuck Norris, Mr. T, and, William Shatner.
But Victor, are you a fan of transmedia marketing with video games?
I think it's pretty cool, actually. It's a great way to get, your product out there kind of thing. Like, for instance, I was walking down the street, and I saw this big billboard above an EB Games for Assassin's Creed, and it was the symbol kind of drawn with arrows, and they kind of, stuck out of the billboard. I thought that was really cool. All right, I'll hang up and hear your thoughts, but before I go, I gotta say I can't wait to hear the Trailblazers game on the Pork tonight.
All right, thanks very much for the call there, Victor. And as he mentioned, you can catch the Portland Trailblazers game. It's their last one of the regular season tonight. Chad Furbush and Leon Doubleday on the call right here on 103.9 The Pork. I'm sure we're both looking forward to that tonight. But Zane, he was bringing up Warcraft. And obviously the World of Warcraft franchise, this is great. This is exactly what I wanted to focus on, actually. They've been extremely successful. It's a game that came out in 2005, obviously online, computer-based multiplayer game. And you know what? It was a great concept. So even in their first year, it did generate $250 million, that being 2005. And you know what? That's good. But these series of ads that we were talking about, and they're featuring celebrities. He mentioned a few, but also Jean-Claude Van Damme, and they used a couple of others. They used Willie Toledo for the Latin American and Spanish-speaking markets. They used many other people, in fact, in these ad campaigns, including Vern Troyer, Ozzy Osbourne, as I mentioned, and that really skyrocketed them in 2007 to really the superpower that they are right now.
And I mean, we're talking about ads that primarily were shown on television, but later on, obviously, this was around the time the rise of YouTube, and a lot of marketers didn't necessarily see the potential in YouTube at this point, but they took a stronghold on that platform. And I mean, now we're talking about a franchise that's made over $2 billion of revenue since 2005. I mean, that's just spectacular. And a big thing has been the amount of revenue they've been able to raise as a result of their marketing both through TV and on YouTube.
Well, this marketing, this transmedia sort of marketing, it's clearly led directly to a great amount of success for the game. Obviously, it was bound to grow, bound to generate as it progressed. It went from $250 million of revenue in the first year, 460 in the next year, a nice progression. But then when they brought out the new series of ads, it increased by 58%, over $800 million in revenue. So you can really see how much of an investment in a different medium has really paid off for the game.
Well, and a cool thing is, I mean, yeah, you can look at it and say, yeah, the ads resulted in better sales, but there was an interactivity. I mean, you mentioned Mr. T was one of the celebrities who did it, and one of the things that they came up with was that there was this Mr. T Mohawk grenade. And it wasn't just going to be something that they make up and it's in the ads, but it was something that they actually introduced into the gameplay. And so the audience, they saw these ads and they saw this Mohawk grenade, and then they went and played the game and went and searched for it. So there was this interactivity that carried over from the advertising campaign into the game itself. And it's something where we've seen, again, where transmedia has affected the actual content of a product.
And transmedia also, we think of actually video games as almost a bit of a niche market, and there are gamers and there are non-gamers to a degree. But if you're putting this on other media that are perhaps more widely used, you can really increase the audience that will play these sort of games. And especially with the diversity in terms of the celebrities they used, the diversity in terms of the different mediums they put this on, in terms of TV and online early YouTube users, very different types of people. And really, if you can increase that audience and market it to more and more people, then you know what, power to them. And obviously they did that extremely successful. That type of marketing, absolutely unprecedented for a video game at that time. And really, Zane, I think it was the catalyst for the same type of advertising seen in other games today, because we both know how common online ads and these type of ads are for video games now.
Well, yeah, and another example that we can get into now is God of War, another franchise that's really utilized transmedia.
Mm-hmm. Well, God of War Ascension, actually, which is the latest one in that series, just came out last month, and their marketing, they made great use of transmedia. They offered a fully downloadable limited trial before the game was released, and obviously this isn't a unique tactic, but it has been successful in the past, the recent past I should mention, and it generated a lot of buzz and excitement for the game.
And they went back to one of the more traditional marketing kind of tactics with this video game as well, that they bought TV space, but it wasn't just any space. They got space during the Super Bowl. We all hear every year how many millions of dollars it costs for a 30-second ad. And they went full out. They went for a full 2-minute commercial during the Super Bowl. And I mean, honestly, it's tough to say how much that's paid off just yet because it's still early in the release. But as far as we can tell, it's been a very successful release of this game. And you got to figure that's played a big role in it.
Well, God of War 3, which was the game that directly preceded God of War Ascension, that was a successful game. Based on the marketing and the use of transmedia so far, because we don't really have a ton of sales numbers out, it only coming out a couple of weeks ago. But in terms of pre-sales, 8 times higher for God of War Ascension. 8 times higher. So I think that's just a clear indication of how effective that's been.
And I actually just got a text from Brenda. She says, what about the Halo franchise? And I mean,
yeah.
we've kind of overlooked a big monster in the closet here with the Halo franchise.
Well, absolutely. And we've been focusing actually a lot on advertising right now, Zane. And there's lots of other ways that you can really add to a video game other than just advertising it. You can add to the story, which is really what Halo's done. And at this point, it's so much more than just a video game. And I think it's credit to them that I think a lot of people have been introduced to this whole Halo series, not through the video game, which is obviously the center where it all started, but through many of their other different mediums they've used. They've got an anime series, they've got short films, they've got books as well, and really just a whole bunch of use of different media to fill in gaps and really add to and enhance the story.
And obviously, I mean, you think, and people kind of compare Halo with Star Wars, and Star Wars is kind of the poster child, we could say, in terms of having a basic story and then having transmedia books, video games, all these different like short films, TV shows that fill in the gaps and build more story, and this is what Halo's done as well. Obviously, there was a decent gap between the last release, Halo 3, and the latest one, and in that time, they've used videos that were released on the platform itself to kind of create questions at the same time as filling in some of the story in terms of what's happened.
Well, let's take a look at some of the specifics, because you mentioned how they used to fill in the story. More than just filling in the story, the Halo franchise actually sort of took parts of it and marketed it and sold it separately that brought in audience another way, the music even. And this is something I don't think we see much in video games, but the Halo 2 soundtrack has sold over 10,000 copies already, which is pretty incredible. And really, the Halo 3 soundtrack actually broke the top 20 best-selling soundtrack and independent albums of 2007. And while the Halo 4 music is actually number 50 on the Billboard 200 here in the U.S., where it was just a couple years ago. I mean, the soundtrack from a video game generating this much interest.
Oh, and it's even you think of a soundtrack from a movie piquing that much interest. It seems rare, but the fact that it's a video game, it's that much more. And it's this, like you said, they're breaking it up, and they're putting different things out there separately. I mean, there's books at the same time, and there's all the different aspects, not only of the story, but even just the auxiliary things to the story, like the music, that are building this fan base.
And I think it's really built it up into a really prestigious entity now. That's what the Halo series is. And there's been talk about a film for a long time, and they started on it, they put it on hiatus right now, but there's lots of buzz about this thing coming back. Microsoft wants to do it. And Steven Spielberg and Neil Blomkamp, and they're two prominent directors, of course. I'm sure most of our audience here knows who both of those two are. They've explicitly expressed interest in directing a Halo movie. All of this coming from just a video game.
And the thing is that the video game was the starting point for all this transmedia, but now if we're talking about a movie at the same time, that's a starting point for a whole other chain of transmedia in the franchise. We're going to see the soundtrack for that sold. We're going to see video games, books based on plot before and after the story of the movie. It's all a starting point, but it's all this big web of transmedia, and Halo may be one of the best examples in terms of a profitable franchise. It has completely taken advantage of this.
Well, it absolutely is, and I know the focus of this discussion was the video game itself, and there's so much to talk about in Halo, but let's look back at the video game itself, and the transmedia, the other aspects, you could say they're sort of complementary to the video game at this point. Obviously, it has the potential to grow into being, so much more beyond the video game. But in terms of especially their initial marketing and their initial use of transmedia towards Halo 2, and that's obviously incredibly successful. Halo 2 was by far the highest selling original Xbox game of all time, 8 million copies. And Zane, can you guess the only other game within 3 million copies of that figure?
Which Halo is it?
It's Halo. It's the original Halo. And of course, these games they're exclusive to Microsoft, and Xbox is the Microsoft system, so wouldn't have figures for other consoles, but 8 million for Halo 2, 5 million for Halo 3, and no other game sold more than 3 million copies, less than half the total of Halo 2. So it really just shows how dominant that series was on the platform. And you know what? Of course, much of the credit goes to the gameplay itself, but that transmedia storytelling clearly had an impact based on these sales alone.
Absolutely. Ryan's actually tweeted at us, and he says, what about Call of Duty? Call of Duty doesn't use transmedia that much.
Well, that is a very valid point. Call of Duty, if you look at the more contemporary sort of games on the Xbox 360, we see Halo, that series has still been really good there. Halo 4 sold 220 million copies within its first 24 hours of release. And you know what? They rank right up there. Halo 4 is the 10th highest selling game of all time. Halo reaches the 8th highest selling game of all time on the Xbox 360, Halo 3 the 6th highest, and that's not to mention all the auxiliary sales of the books, and there's so many figures, we can't get into all it right now. But Call of Duty, as you mentioned, the Call of Duty franchise accounts for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th best-selling games in the Xbox 360, all ahead of any of the Halo 3, 4, and Reach franchises, and they really haven't used transmedia very much.
Now, I'll stop you there, Kurt, and Ryan will tell you as well. That's not completely true. They maybe haven't used it in the way that we've seen other games use it, but we have seen some short films. Mind you, these were made by fans, as well as some comic books. But the interesting thing is that this wasn't content that built on the storyline. It was kind of independent of the series itself. It was stuff that just created this universe, but it wasn't as interrelated. It wasn't this web that we're talking about with Halo.
Yeah, that's true. And unless I'm mistaken, I think the comic books, it's sort of a tale featuring one of the central characters from the game, but really not interlinking with the principal stories throughout any of the games. Sort of a completely separate saga with one of these characters. So you're right, it would generate interest in terms of the brand being out there, but not nearly to the degree that Halo's done. But listen, Halo has been highly acclaimed in terms of the gameplay itself as well, and Call of Duty has by and large outsold it in the last decade, so clearly Transmedia isn't all that you need to push it over the top.
Or at least, I mean, I guess you could kind of call what's happened with the Call of Duty franchise maybe a different flavor of Transmedia.
And yet another flavor of Transmedia, just to transition here a little bit to movies away from the video games, as of course we got a lot of tweets about those as well. Let's look at The Dark Knight, and really the Dark Knight franchise, and they really sort of broke some barriers. They did some new things in terms of really involving the audience in the experience and generating excitement before the movies.
Yeah, and we saw things both on the internet and actual physical things that you found around the city. Portland was one of the cities that did this.
Right.
Start with the online thing. It was the system where you can find police files online, and you had to identify markings that were typical to the Joker.
Yeah, and you could find, once you found these files and you identified them, you'd find what was written inside these, and it would give you a location based on clues. And so everybody was able to figure out those clues, would meet up at this location, dressed up as the Joker, and they all sort of did this rally, like this march thing, as the Joker's Fiends, I think they called themselves.
Yeah, but it was cool because there was the opposing rally as well that was for Harvey Dent. So you had both sides of the coin going at once.
No, there was the political... funny reference, both sides of the coin there, Harvey Dent, of course. But no, you had a political rally going for Harvey Dent to stop the Joker. So you're getting these people ahead of time, and you're getting them involved, and you're sort of choosing sides and building an allegiance. And that really creates an investment in the video game, and you're getting people physically together to do these things. And it's a lot more sort of physical than we see a lot of these campaigns.
It's one thing to have a campaign where people are sitting in their chairs at home on the computer. It's another thing to get them out there in the public, like a rally before a movie. Who would have thought?
Well, exactly. And the franchise really went all out too, because they used that. They used the online. They used the actual physical mediums. But some of the more traditional Transmedia, if you can say that at this point, was used as well. They had billboards around the city, like a billboard of Harvey Dent that was all Jokerized, for lack of a better term, spray painted, etc. $1 bills that were being Jokerized, going around with Abe Lincoln all defaced. And you know what? The Joker's people congregated at this one particular rally, and there was actually a biplane that flew over and wrote a phone number in the sky, and they had to call it to find a hostage or for a hostage phone call and find out, exactly where they were going and solidify them in the Joker's crew.
Yeah, I mean, it was a cool thing.
Unprecedented.
They made it feel like Portland was Gotham City. They made it feel like New York City was Gotham City. They took the movie experience and tried to make it a real thing for these fans for periods of time, and it created so much interest, so much hype for these movies.
Well, yeah, it was unbelievable, the hype, and it was so much buzz, and I'd never seen anything like this here in Portland in terms of the pre-show buzz, and people are sympathizing with the bad guy like crazy too, which was absolutely unheard of. But you had people so invested in the movie, they felt like they're a part of it. It was almost like their team, say, to give a little bit of a sports context, it was like your team going into this big pre-scripted sort of game, albeit, but you know what, you're cheering, you have a real allegiance, and that involves you so much more than if you're just a casual observer.
Yeah, and The Dark Knight continued this with the third movie in the series, The Dark Knight Rises, where we saw across cities in the U.S. and north of the border as well in Canada, the little bat symbols. I'm sure you saw the movie with the little bat symbols as part of the resistance.
Yeah.
And so people would take photos of these, and if they were the first ones to find them, then they end up with free tickets to the premiere.
Yeah, and that's something absolutely unique as well, that they started giving out free exclusive tickets based solely on these, contests that involved commitment and physically going to stuff, not just being the 10th caller or, at the 1,000th person or the first person to tweet. But they also involved people, they did a lot of campaigns in this whole series that they didn't really tell people about. And for example, in Pittsburgh, of course, the big skyscraper there, known as Fifth Avenue, placed prominent skyscraper, and they filmed a lot of the scenes in Pittsburgh, and they just put a huge Batman symbol, just shone it on this huge skyscraper, and really got people buzzing about, oh, Batman, what's going on here.
Yeah, and another thing, it was cool. They actually included the fans in terms of the recording of the soundtrack. We talked about soundtracks earlier.
Yes.
The famous chant in the prison. I don't even want to try and take a hack at it.
Well, it's like De Shibasara. Like, do you remember when they're all climbing?
Yes, I remember how I said it. I didn't want to make a fool of myself.
So I did it.
So they got fans to actually send in recordings of the chant, and they got mass recordings of fans doing this chant, and that's the audio they used to create the recording or recreate the audio for that scene in the movie.
Yeah, that's right. It's all these prisoners chanting together, and really it's just all these fans. So, you know what? If you took the time to actually do that, I kind of regret that I didn't at this point, to be honest, Zane. But you're in the movie. You are a part of that. And it's an acclaimed movie in terms of the soundtrack. I believe The Dark Knight just cleaned up in terms of those various awards. But you know what? You're getting the audience not only... Well, they're actually a part of the movie, like
exactly.
Literally a part of the movie.
And it's a thing where we see it's this whole transmedia storytelling where the audience actually helps form part of the story. They help decide what the content will be. They help create the content. And it's something we've never seen before. And it's something that, especially in the case of The Dark Knight, and we talked about with the radio shows before, where it's amazingly effective. It creates so much interest. It from a business side of things, gosh, does it ever peak your revenue? I mean,
well, no kidding. The numbers absolutely don't lie. And the majority of this marketing and the physical sort of marketing occurred in the U.S. But of course, it didn't just extend to the U.S. The videos, and talk about this sort of campaign, of course, went overseas, and it was a big success internationally. The Dark Knight grossed over $1 billion worldwide, which is just phenomenal. 534 million of that in the U.S.
Yeah, no, it's an absolutely amazing thing. And you have to figure that a decent... And that's one of the more amazing things about that is the fact that it's a third movie in a trilogy. How often do you see a third movie being that successful?
Well, that's The Dark Knight, actually. I was talking about the second movie there. The third movie did even better, unbelievably. They did... Perhaps the novelty of the sort of the Joker stuff was gone a little bit by the third movie, so they only grossed $450 million in the U.S., but internationally they did even better, $1.01 billion worldwide, actually surpassing the predecessor, The Dark Knight, which was just so critically acclaimed as well as being so highly marketed.
Yeah, jumped ahead there, ruined your point there, Kurt.
Yeah, well, that's all right. These things happen on live radio. Let's continue on to the James Bond series, because that's the series that's been going on forever. You know what? If there is any sort of movie coming out that you think wouldn't really need to be jump-started by a sort of transmedia marketing campaign, it's James Bond. So many people grew up watching it. There's been so many different Bonds. It's well established in the marketplace as just a classic already. And you know what? The two previous Bonds, Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, have done very, very well. But this new Bond movie, Skyfall, they really took advantage of transmedia and with great success as well.
Well, yeah, one of the cool commercials we saw during the campaign was the Heineken commercial where innocent bystander gets mixed up with Daniel Craig, but Daniel Craig. And then the chase ensues on this train. And they kind of took that feeling, then actually got people thrust into that as well. We saw one example at Antwerp Central Station in Belgium, where participants who were buying a Coke would be challenged to complete this Bond-esque mission. They'd be running through the station, trying to avoid all these obstacles, and if they completed it in time, then they got free tickets to the movie.
No, it's true. It was actually a really brilliant campaign. They had 70 seconds to go to one particular platform, and it sounds pretty easy, but there'd be all these people who seem like innocent bystanders, a woman walking like 12 dogs who just gets in your way in the only stairway, two guys carrying a huge pane of glass for no particular reason, an orange seller knocks over his cart. But you know what was my favorite thing actually of that entire ad, and maybe this is just me, but all the musicians that were sort of there asking for money in the subway weren't actually. They were all obviously paid people, and they were playing the Bond theme the whole time. Yeah, they're playing the theme. So you had the guy in violin, guy in guitar.
I was just waiting for someone to run through that glass.
Yes,
I think then maybe
too.
we'd hear a lawsuit from this transmedia campaign.
Yeah, but fortunately that didn't happen. I think everybody actually went and got the tickets, and it made quite a commercial. So not only was it a great physical experience, an ingenious idea, but they made a 2-minute commercial out of that as well, and it's been a hit both on TV and on YouTube.
Well, and a cool thing is that this also kept fans kind of thinking about the franchise. Now when you're out buying a Coke or whatever, you're out buying a soda at the train station, you're thinking, geez, maybe I could be next. Maybe I'll be lucky enough to find one of these things. And although it obviously didn't happen all over the place, it kept people thinking about the movie. We all know as marketers, one of the most important things is, can you get your audience to continue to think about the product after the commercial's done. And this is something that completely did that, and it's amazing the way it did.
And obviously the numbers don't lie. Once again, the Skyfall, of course, the entire Bond series, it's a UK-based series, and they smashed box office records in the UK. And I mean smashed it. They were the first movie ever to pull in over $100 million in theaters there in Britain. And it was actually entirely successful in the US as well, grossing over $300 million there, which was almost double Quantum Solace, the predecessor, and Casino Royale, which, you know what, they came in around the same number, around $160 million, so there wasn't much progression from one to the other. You know what, not bad numbers at all, but nothing compared to the $300 million they generated there.
Kurt, you keep saying the numbers never lie. I'm starting to think that you want to go on Stats Never Lie later on in the day.
No, that's Toby Kerr, Tyler Zoltek, and Alex Bloomfield. Good friends of the show, of course. We like to have them on once in a while. But just getting back to it right now, Skyfall grossed over $800 million worldwide, just shy of that number. So, you know what? It speaks to the absolute success of that franchise.
No, absolutely.
But there are other ways to do it too, of course, Zane, as we've seen recently with Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained. You know what? You can really have a lighter use of transmedia if you have, prestigious director and prestigious actors, and we've seen this with Django, and it's already been very successful so far.
Yeah, absolutely. A movie actually I'm a big fan of. But yeah, it's interesting. They just kind of went like the typical, I guess you'd say, like early 2000s kind of route, where it's just a website to go along with the movie, and that was about it.
And they still did extremely well, even right off the bat. $34 million in its first day in theaters, which is excellent, especially considering they didn't do a massive campaign to try and get people in right away. In total, it's already grossed $420 million, despite only being released 3 months ago. And it's some edgy content in there as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I guess really in terms of how useful the transmedia is in terms of the marketing of the film, I'd say, I don't know, personally, I'd say it's very effective, but the jury's out if you can get away without using it still.
Well, yes, and I think what we've seen from this so far is that there are other ways to get around transmedia, or I should say other ways to be successful without too much use of transmedia, but really it has also been extremely successful and really does help. Now,
we mentioned video games, mentioned movies, but one thing that we haven't really mentioned are films that rolled out a video game at the same time of the movie. The first one I got here is Men in Black. The film came out on May 25th of last year, but a couple days before that, they released Men in Black Alien Crisis, a video game, to kind of really make that last-minute push towards people getting their interest drawn in towards the movie.
And I think what's so indicative of this being a successful strategy, the video game movie simultaneously, if you look at the reviews of these two, Men in Black, so reviews in theaters. The video game itself, actually generally bad reviews, but both of them made a lot of money.
Oh yeah, it was actually the most profitable movie in the entire series. They grossed $624 million in theaters over the run. We should mention also there was a mobile phone game that was released even a week earlier. Not really many reviews on that. I don't think that was too viral, but nonetheless, all these factors kind of led into people really pouring into theaters to watch what wasn't a great movie.
Yeah, well, that's up for debate, all right? I'm a big Men in Black fan, but critically, yes, of course. And it's been clearly successful. I think they're on, their fourth movie now?
The fourth one would be coming up.
Something like that.
See, it's neat, though, because you look at the transmedia aspect in terms of the marketing of the films, that they use video games. Obviously, they had the official website that had teasers and the trailer and everything. They had the Twitter handle that was mainly used to promote products, promote the series as a whole. But the series itself was based on comic books to start. So we're seeing really this kind of synergy of transmedia storytelling as well as transmedia marketing.
Well, that's it. And I think the difference here, the real distinction, and probably in my mind why it's been so successful, is rather than having one central product, I suppose maybe you could say the movie's the central product, but rather than having one central item and then having peripheral transmedia to market that, if you simultaneously released more than one big item on different mediums, then you know what? It works out extremely well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sony, of course, the producer of Men in Black, didn't try and do this by themselves. They actually brought in an outside company, Starlight Runner Entertainment, who's a company that specializes in transmedia storytelling, which obviously the Men in Black franchise has followed. And you could say that may have been one of the big things that really influenced them and helped this franchise make so much money on the third film, which typically we saw the third film of a franchise being pretty weak.
But clearly that wasn't the case here. And actually, we had a lot of people posting about a first movie in a series, or perhaps an eventual series, that being District 9. I know one of your personal favorites, all about aliens and whatnot.
Not at all, really. But part of the reason I actually got out to see the film was because of the marketing campaign. It drew you in. We saw a similar thing to Batman. We saw they had billboards, banners, posters. There were stickers put up around cities across the U.S., across Canada. I think they even touched Europe a little bit. And it wasn't advertising the movie, but it was, again, immersing the population of these cities to make them feel like they're a part of the plot. And again, this is a plot they necessarily didn't know a lot about at the time, but of course it was whole aliens against humans things, and we saw like anti-alien posters, we saw stickers anti-human, and it got people wondering, well, what's this about? Like, what's going on? I'm sure even some people would consider briefly like, oh my god, is this something real? Are there aliens living amongst us?
No, well, obviously the aliens invading Earth, that's a theme that, it's as old as movies, so we've seen that forever. So obviously District 9 had to do something different, and they all this physical sort of advertising that they did, and the unique advertising where you really weren't seeing that it was ads for the movie, but it was just, fear tactics almost, and that gets people excited, and that gets people who are into this genre. Obviously, I don't know how you categorize it, maybe a bit of a thriller sort of. There's definitely some scary elements, some sort of horror elements, as well as the action. So, you get the adrenaline going, you get the nervousness around a little bit, like, what is this, all this alien stuff? So it obviously worked extremely well.
Well, and it's an interesting thing, because you have people likely commuting to and from work, and rather than just sitting there staring at the back of someone's head, they're bored, they're not thinking about anything, they're seeing these non-human, like pro-human signs, and they're thinking, man, like, that'd be cool. And it almost, I think maybe there's a little bit of kid in all of us. It almost, you kind of play along with it in your mind a little bit, and that's what keeps you going. I mean, they had toll-free numbers to report non-human activity. I mean, that's not something you see around the city regularly.
Yeah, no, it's true. That's very, very true, actually. And that involvement that we talked about, it's a lot like the Joker's army that you said in The Dark Knight, and you have people really involved and, feeling that they have a legitimate stake in this movie, so it's really more of a part of their life than just a bit of a viewing experience.
Yeah, and it was cool. In San Diego at Comic-Con, before the movie was released, they were actually accepting applications to join the multinational United movement. Obviously, in the movie, those were the ones that were kind of seeking out the aliens and fighting them, however you want to put that. But it included people as part of the storyline. And then when they went and saw the movie, they thought, hey, I'm part of that MNU. I'm part of that.
Right, exactly. So it's like the Joker's army that you saw, or, you know what, if you feel like you voted for Harvey Dent, feels like you've done something to protect your planet, obviously that's absolutely huge. They also, beyond that, they ran these different MNU websites with different feeds, and they had these local alert systems. Like, they really set up this whole fake, emergency system, almost like we were genuinely expecting a nuclear attack or something of the like.
And it was cool. I mean, I'm sure there were plenty of people who were very, very into all this transmedia that was out there. They were very into the idea of the movie, and I'm sure there were even people who had this set as their homepage. It was the first thing they looked at when they turned on their computer in the morning.
And there's those who goes against the grain, of course, as well. And we've seen this tapped into, and I thought District 9 did a particularly good job of this. I read actually many of these blog posts. I'm not sure if you got to see this, but there was also a fictional alien, well, I think he's fictional anyway. Some people might disagree with me anyway. Christopher Johnson, and he ran the opposite sort of. He ran an anti-MNU blog, so he was really, the big antagonist here. But you know what? That attracts some audience as well.
So it was an interesting campaign because, again, we've talked so much today about transmedia in terms of marketing. But they did this with the storyline. They included people in the storyline, and it's not that they affected it quite as much, not like in Batman where there was a vocal aspect and fans were part of the movie itself, but it was still people felt like they were part of the movie. They felt like they were part of it beforehand, and part of this was an online game that they put out beforehand where players would choose if they were aliens or humans, and then they would play out parts of the film, and you didn't know what was coming in the film, so it was all such new, interesting information.
Well, I think that is absolutely the key point here, and this is part of the reason why I think District 9 is categorized as such a big success. It is this online game. It's sort of similar to Men in Black, and I think they're both comparable too in that, you know what, they're anticipated movies, I guess. They're pretty highly anticipated movies, but they wouldn't have nearly had the fanfare. I mean, without all the shenanigans that the Dark Knight series really put into it. It's a Christopher Nolan movie. It's about Batman. It's starring Christian Bale. It was going to get a big viewership. It was going to get big numbers as it was. That their Transmedia campaign pushed it to, huge numbers. But these two movies, Men in Black, District 9, probably not as much fanfare, and they pushed it from being, mediocre lower sellers to getting some very nice numbers, especially on, some relatively low budget films.
Well, yeah, exactly. District 9, only a $30 million budget. This was a film where we saw almost no big names whatsoever in terms of the talent in the movie.
Very true.
There was there wasn't a lot going on. Like before Men in Black, we mentioned there were the comic books. Same thing, obviously. Batman's been around forever.
Right.
But District 9, this was very much so a wholly new topic, and it still went out and grossed $210 million, which on a $30 million budget, that's just insane.
Well, to put it in perspective, The Dark Knight Rises, which grossed over $1 billion, but $250 million was the budget. So just an astronomical budget, huge payoff, huge payout. But you know what? This is the way that most movies have to do it. Most movies don't have the giant industry, don't have the giant sort of budget that the Dark Knight series did, and they have to do more like what a District 9 and what a Men in Black did, using a little less money. Maybe your profits or your total gross revenue isn't as high, but the profit margin is just as good, really, in the long term. And it's just a very effective strategy that I think a lot more people are going to adopt in the long run.
There's the closing bell, Kurt. You know what that means? Final thoughts.
Yes, well, I think what it all comes down to, Zane, is that we can agree Transmedia is effective. Maybe it's not 100% necessary in order to be successful. We've seen several examples of that already today, but you know what? It certainly helps.
Yeah, and it really depends on what your platform is, what your audience is. I mean, you look at, back at the start of the show, we talked about the Dean Blundell show. Uses a lot of transmedia, uses a ton of social media, really allows the audience to interact with the show and help build the content. But that's not something that Primetime Sports uses. And then there's a big discrepancy in terms of the audiences there. Dean Blundell's show, very focused on youth, versus Primetime Sports, which maybe you don't want to say is focused, but the audience primarily is middle-aged and older gentlemen.
Well, I think that maybe that is also sort of because of the medium that they use in terms of radio. And part of, I think, what we went to solve here today in terms of the show, in terms of exploring transmedia, is which medium is it most effective on. And do you think that we really have a conclusion on that?
Oh, not at all. I mean, if we look at the difference between video games and movies, it's been immensely useful, immensely productive in terms of using transmedia for both of them. And one thing that we explored with our last two examples, Men in Black and District 9, is the use of transmedia in terms of kind of releasing on multiple platforms at the same time, and that whole idea of not just transmedia marketing, but transmedia storytelling.
Yes, and I think that really what it comes down to, and from what I've seen, this is what I gathered, is that what is most effective is not necessarily releasing one central sort of item of media, one central game, say, one central movie, one central radio show, and then, building sort of peripheral transmedia outside of that. And obviously, it's more effective, Zane, when you have two or more major sort of platforms that you're really targeting, and you sort of build around that you want to have more than one major platform that are necessarily going together in terms of creating a larger story rather than having one and building around that. And the problem here, and I think this is where we can sort of evaluate which medium can use transmedia more effectively, is that radio shows you can't really do that with.
No, it's tough, and we mentioned it's a level playing field. Almost everyone does it.
Yeah.
So it's not like some movies do it, some movies don't. Some games have done it, some haven't. They've both been successful. In order to have a successful radio show, you essentially need at least some of that transmedia element.
You need that transmedia element, but it's sort of, you can't really, unless you're simulcasting as Bob McCown and Primetime Sports do, you can't really release a central product on more than one medium.
No, it's still your product is still focused on the radio show itself.
But I think that the strategy that more and more people are going to go to, and more people should go to, is the Men in Black, is the District 9. It's the video game movie simultaneous release. You know what, maybe it takes a little more resources, but clearly if you have that blitz, you have the media attention on one, it's going to be drawn to the other, and vice versa, and they can build off of each other. So I really think that we're seeing that that is the most effective way to use transmedia, and that is the future.
All right, for once, Kurt, it looks like we finally agree on something here on the show. So I'd like to thank all the audience that participated today. We had a couple tweets. We had some stuff on the Facebook page. We had a caller. We had some text messages. Great participation across the board. Coming up tomorrow, we'll have James McNally from the Portland Chamber of Commerce joining us on the show. Right after us, will be Rodney and the Emperor. Be sure to stay tuned in for that. And later tonight, the Portland Trailblazers game live here on the Pork.
Yeah, just like I mentioned before, last game of the regular season tonight, Chad Furbush, Leon Doubleday on the call. I'll be listening, and you should too.
All right, so for Kurt Tobias, I'm Zane Moltek. As always, thank you for listening to Biz Talk.